Hello, and thank you for joining us all virtually today. My name is Jade Benjamin Chung. I'm an assistant professor in epidemiology and population health at Stanford University, as well as a faculty affiliate of the Stanford King Center on Global Development. And today we've convened an exciting panel discussion on malaria eradication. Before we jump into the topic for today, I want to share a little bit about the King Center. So the King Center is working to help improve the lives of people living in poverty around the world. The center does this in three main ways. We support research that aims to inform policy and practice on critical development issues. We help train the next generation of thinkers and leaders in global development. And we foster conversations like this one about current issues in poverty alleviation and development. We've convened this panel today to discuss malaria, a life-threatening disease that endangers nearly half of the world's population. Malaria impacts impoverished communities the most, and children are its first victims. I'm honored to moderate this event and introduce our three outstanding researchers. Drawing from their experience around the world, they will present on ongoing efforts and successes in malaria eradication. We will then open up to audience questions, which you'll be able to submit through the Q&A feature. And I think we need to advance our slides. There we go to Jane. So first is Dr. Jane Achan. She's a medical doctor with a PhD in biomedical sciences, a master's degree in pediatrics and child health, and master's training in clinical trials. She's the Senior Research Advisor at Malaria Consortium, where she oversees and supports the research agenda across several countries in Africa and Asia. She'll draw on 20 years of experience in clinical and operational research to provide us with an overview of the progress in malaria eradication and current programs and barriers from a global perspective. Next, Dr. Ali Olotu will focus on malaria vaccines and describe the state of the research and current hurdles, approaches to equitable vaccine distribution, and promising malaria vaccine candidates. He is a senior research scientist from the Ifakara Health Institute with an interest in infectious disease epidemiology, interventions, and innovations to tackle the burden of diseases in developing countries. Finally, Dr. Michelle Hsiang will discuss implementation and operational research priorities for eradication. Next slide, please. She's an associate professor in epidemiology and biostatistics with a secondary appointment in the Department of Pediatrics at UC San Francisco. And she serves as the Director of Research for the Malaria Elimination Initiative at the Institute for Global Health Sciences. Her research is in the epidemiology of malaria in low endemic settings, aiming for elimination. So now that we've familiarized ourselves with our accomplished researchers, I'd like to welcome Jane to the stage, so to say, for her overview of malaria eradication.
Thanks, Jade. So I'll be just presenting an overview of malaria eradication, looking at the historical perspectives, but also explaining some of the main barriers and biggest threats to success. Next slide. Before we do that, I think it's important that we have a common understanding of some key terms. And these key terms that we will be using recurrently are malaria control, malaria elimination, and malaria eradication. So control means reduction of disease incidence, prevalence, morbidity, or mortality to a locally acceptable level as a result of deliberate efforts. Continued interventions are required to be able to sustain control. Malaria elimination, on the other hand, refers to the interruption of local transmission or a reduction to zero incidence of indigenous cases of a specific malaria parasite in a defined geographical area as a result of deliberate activities. In this context as well, continued measures are needed to prevent the re-establishment of transmission. And malaria eradication, which is the focus of this webinar, is really a permanent reduction to zero of the worldwide incidence of infection caused by human malaria parasites as a result of deliberate activities. In this context, once eradication is achieved, interventions are no longer required. Next slide. So why is eradication important? I mean, a world free of malaria is a major goal of global health. Currently, in the 2020 World Malaria Report, over 247 million cases of malaria were reported and 619 deaths in just 1 year. 95% of this is in Africa, predominantly in children under 5 years of age. So eradicating malaria would have the greatest beneficial impact on the world's most vulnerable populations. It would also save millions of lives, improve health and health equity, and also generate significant economic benefit. Studies have shown that 10% reduction in malaria incidence is associated with an average rise of 0.3% in GDP and a really much higher average gain in GDP, particularly in the higher burden and the low-income countries. Next slide. So a bit of learning from history and what has happened in the past. And one of the milestones for malaria eradication is the WHO's Global Malaria Eradication Program that was launched in 1955 and really continued until 1969. This was a very ambitious attempt to achieve a malaria-free world for the first time. And it really was a well-designed program that consisted of preparations before the interventions, an attack phase, a consolidation phase, and what is called a maintenance phase. And the objectives were really to reduce transmission, reduce the incidence of disease, and ultimately clear the existing parasite reservoir of infection, and largely focus on the use of insecticides, DDT for vector control, and the use of chloroquine at that time for both prevention and treatment of malaria. While this approach led to elimination of malaria in many countries, actually 15 countries and 1 territory, it failed to achieve global eradication. And this plan was also not fully implemented in sub-Saharan Africa, which was a particular disadvantage given that the greatest burden of malaria is in sub-Saharan Africa. And the falling short of this eradication led to a sense of defeat. Significant investments had been made, and this also led to the neglect of malaria control efforts and really an abandonment of research in new tools for a period of time. And because of this, malaria returned with a vengeance, millions of deaths followed, and it really took decades before the world was ready to fight malaria again. Next slide. So there are some important lessons that were learned from the Global Malaria Eradication Program that was not successful. I think one of the key lessons learned at that time was these strategies need to account for the hardest places from the outset to avoid failure, given that the burden of disease is in some of these hard-to-reach areas. The other lesson learned was that it was also difficult to promise eradication quite early, and difficult to use this as a resource mobilization strategy, as ultimately there's a risk of donor and political fatigue, especially when the goals are not achieved in time. National malaria elimination strategies also needed to be designed to fit country context and to retain flexibility and ensure that there are adjustments in both the short and long term, given the changes that are observed. And also the critical role of research and development are critical until eradication is achieved, even beyond that, to limit any risks that may remain. And from these lessons, I think really the outcome of the second or any subsequent attempts at eradications will have profound implications, not only for malaria, but also other diseases that are currently under consideration for eradication. Next slide. So following a period of frustration, I think the malaria community came together once again, and a lot of research and development took place, and that research led to interventions that largely contributed to subsequent success. And the developments were really the discovery of the long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, the development of rapid diagnostic tests for optimal diagnosis of malaria, and then also the discovery of the artemisinin-based combination therapies that improved treatment outcomes. And because of this, there was a significant achievement in the decline of malaria incidence over the years from 2000 to 2015. So significant decline in both the incidence of cases, but also mortality was achieved over this period of time. And with that significant decline, there was a renewed interest and enthusiasm for tackling malaria again. However, since 2015, there's been a significant reversal in the gains that had been previously observed, currently throwing the malaria community into a bit of a challenge yet again. Next slide. So a number of different aspects were seen to have contributed to this reversal in trend in the initial unprecedented decline, and also presenting as threats to any further approaches to malaria eradication. So these involve the parasite. The parasite population dynamics evolved over time. There were significant mutations and resistance to ongoing drugs developed, and all changes that impacted on diagnosis and treatment over time. There were also changes in the vector population with the new emerging vectors like the Anopheles stevensii that we currently have. Also development of resistance and different operational challenges really in the deployment of vector control interventions. Those factors, including comorbidities and different vulnerabilities, genetic, age, gender, and other socioeconomic demographics played a role. Of course, the significant involvement of the environment with the current climate change activities and the deterioration which increases the human vector contact. Health systems have also been broken down, and this has led to the collapse of the malaria control programs in some countries. Of course, we all know some of the interruptions that were caused by the COVID-19 pandemic as part of these challenges. Also challenges to access that include both geographical or financial and significant governance challenges, including political instability, insecurity. Significant population movements have also been reported in this reversal in trend. Next slide. Additional challenges and threats are compromised efficacy of the malaria response tools that require the need for additional interventions that we need to be developed. So it's interesting that the next talk will be on the malaria vaccines. Also changes in the technical and medical response to malaria. Instead of working in silos, there needs to be a whole of society approach to malaria, including peer embedment of the communities and the households as well. Also an understanding that one size does not fit all. We have to have, even within the country context, subnational tailoring of interventions, a better understanding of what to use, where to use it, and when to use it. Of course, issues about program capacity in the different countries, and also a dependency on donor funding for a lot of the malaria response across the different countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. So learning from all these lessons, I think one of the things that we need to consider is what should a successful approach to malaria eradication look like? And clearly, I think the logical approach is really to first focus on burden eradication, burden reduction and sequential elimination in the malaria endemic countries and regions, really where the high burden of malaria is. And to help these countries reduce burden and eliminate malaria from within their borders, and then subsequently push towards elimination, there are really four focus areas that needs to be maintained. Research and development of new tools. Indeed, the third talk today is going to look at this particular access, but also access to affordable, quality, people-centered health services is quite key. Surveillance and rescue. Surveillance is critical as it keeps track of the trend over time and also informs the adequate response that is needed. And then recognizing that there's significant diversity within regions and within countries, and ensuring that we have subnational, national, and regional strategies in response. And of course, other important enabling factors, particularly community engagement. Without the communities, the uptake of these interventions will be limited. Next slide. So if we want to look at a pragmatic way forward and how the world should be able to review or look at malaria eradication, I think overall, eradication must remain the global vision that we have. Despite the challenges, despite the failures in the past, eradication must remain the global vision. And this goal can only be achieved through the reduction of the global malaria burden and progressive elimination of malaria in countries and regions where the high burden remains. We therefore need to get back on track to achieve important public health goals that are on this critical pathway to eradication. And once we've achieved the really elimination settings, then work together to cover that last mile to eradication at the correct point in time. So looking at the current epidemiology and the trend in malaria across much of the world, the endemic world, now does not seem to be the right time to push for an eradication date. We should not set the world up to another failed malaria eradication effort. that could delay further attempts to achieve this desired vision. So strategic focus must remain on malaria control and elimination, which faces two key challenges, and these challenges need to be addressed. And one of those challenges is really how to sustain past success and scale up new interventions within the existing resources, but also how to continuously adapt intervention strategies to local conditions which can change rapidly, and how to be able to effectively respond to emerging challenges. And the current challenges include really resistance to the current tools, age shifts with malaria shifting to older children and adolescents, and also to understand the growing heterogeneity in disease burden and to be able to tailor interventions according to the burden in the different localities. Last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Jade.
Thank you very much, Jane. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Ali Olotu, who's going to be speaking about vaccines for malaria eradication. I think you're on mute, Ali.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes. So as the previous speaker pointed out, and actually set up my talk very nicely, is that we definitely need to develop new intervention, and therefore sort of supporting the research, such as what the Stanford University is doing, obviously is an important aspect in the efforts to control and finally eliminate malaria. So malaria vaccines are essential, and they're essential when it comes to what has just been alluded to, sort of to control, eliminate, and eventually eradicate malaria. And I think we definitely need a new tool that will support the existing tool. Vaccines, as we know, they are one of the most cost-effective public health interventions that have played a significant role in reducing the infectious disease burden and eradicate some of the infectious diseases such as smallpox. So having a malaria vaccine would definitely be an added advantage in the whole effort of tackling the burden of malaria and achieving elimination. So over the years, the task of the research scientists across the globe has been focusing on developing a highly efficacious vaccine that would be able to meet the expectation of the sort of public health officials in terms of sort of reducing malaria burden. And here we're talking about sort of generating highly potent and functional sort of immunity. So this has been a very important aspect of developing malaria vaccine, and also selecting the right antigens or right epitopes that would induce a desirable immune responses that would lead to protection against malaria, against sort of wild malaria exposure, and also overcome some of the challenges that have faced these efforts for many, many years, and that is to sort of overcome the immune evasion that the malaria itself sort of has, but also the immune modulation that the malaria itself has, so that we can have potent vaccines. Next. Oh yeah. So how do we sort of reach that goal of developing these vaccines that would play a significant role or impact in the malaria control, elimination, and eventual eradication? So the manufacturers, the funders, as well as the other key stakeholders met to develop this roadmap that kind of define what are some of these strategic objective of sort of making sure that we achieve the goal. And one of it was to develop a malaria vaccine with a protective efficacy of at least 75% against clinical malaria. And secondly, was to have a vaccine that can significantly reduce malaria transmission and which are fit to use in multiple transmission setting, and which are sort of easy to deliver, such as with, within mass vaccination campaigns. So these are the goals, and the roadmap sort of defines that if you want to achieve the success, this should be what what developers should aim at and researchers should aim at. Next. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So one of the success story in the efforts to develop malaria vaccine, which has taken many, many years, has been the RTSS vaccine. And probably most of you must have heard it. It was sort of recommended by WHO in October 2021. And I think the RTSS success or development started in the early 1980s, following the first demonstration that with the irradiated sporozoite, you can actually produce or elicit an immune response that is give individuals, both sort of animals, of course, in preclinical studies, but also in humans, a sterile protection. And of course, it was difficult to practically, vaccinate individuals then. But then a lot of research went around understanding what was going on, and then came the discovery of the circumsporozoite protein as a major and important protein on the surface of the sporozoite, and later on this paved a way for the subunits, development of subunit vaccines for the malaria. And of course, the DNA, sort of the DNA recombinant technology was also critical technology that facilitated the development of the RTSS early on. So there were a series of studies that started in, of course, adults in West Africa, which then culminated into studies in Mozambique, in children. And it was quite evident early on that although the efficacy found in Gambia, for instance, was short-lived, but any delay in sort of time to infection or sort of reducing the burden of the infectious dose that individual get, this could translate into a more sort of a better clinical outcome in children who were the a group that bear the largest burden of the disease. So there was a critical decision made to move forward with the development of RTSS at that critical stage after those early studies in Gambia that were published. So then there were a series, of course, of studies that took place across the continent, looking at different, for instance, adjuvant, as well as sort of looking at how the vaccine interacts with EPI vaccines that are given in sort of during childhood. And these studies then, of course, culminated into a phase 3 that is a large study carried out across 7 countries in Africa, involving well over 16,000 children and infants. So the results, the key results of the phase 3 RTSS study showed that, of course, the vaccine was able to prevent clinical malaria by about 40%. And more importantly, was the 30% efficacy against severe malaria. It was also shown that the 4 dose that was given in children was very, very important, because then it was able to avert almost 2,000 cases per each 1,000 clinical malaria cases. So I think this was an important milestone in the fights against, or in the struggles to develop an effective malaria vaccine that would provide sort of an additional push towards sort of control, and then then we can then start talk about elimination, as it has been described earlier. But there was some few safety concerns. 2 major ones was, of course, the febrile seizure after vaccination. They were sort of imbalance, and a little bit more febrile seizures in individuals, in children who received RTSS. But also there was a risk of meningitis, which initially, of course, was thought to be a chance finding, but it was important to really investigate this further. So the WHO, of course, as you know, recommended a pilot implementation in 3 countries. And this studies was an important one First of all, to demonstrate, of course, the possibility of giving this vaccine in the community, including, of course, giving the 4th dose after a year after the 3rd dose. So it was sort of an important practical consideration to ensure that, yes, because this 4th dose was very, very critical. But also it was important to verify and make sure that the vaccine is safe, and also look at the impact of mortality. So it was not possible to look at the impact of mortality in phase 3 study, because as you can imagine, in clinical trials, the standard of care was really, upgraded, making sure that, the children who are participating in these trials sort of got the most, high level of clinical care. And therefore, it was very difficult to measure mortality in that situation, impact on mortality in such situations. So there was sort of a general reduction in number of in mortality overall in the study. So what we know after this pilot implementation is that, of course, the vaccine can prevent severe malaria by 30%, sort of replicating what was seen. It was very cost effective, and added was sort of the advantage was in addition to other interventions which were given. But what we don't know until now is, of course, the booster dose, whether it is important, because still studies was being evaluated, and also impact on mortality was still being assessed. Next, please. Next. So what myself, of course, and a number of colleagues also looked in phase 2 was which was very important also to inform the analysis of the phase 3 study, was to look at the longevity of the efficacy, which is quite important aspect for this vaccine, but also looked at other groups as well, looked at sort of strain specificity. And I wanted to share this because what we saw in mostly in Kenya, in an area where malaria transmission, of course, was not was moderate to low, but using quite an innovative way of measuring individual exposure, using sort of what is around the number of malaria, clinical malaria cases around the proximity of an individual. We were able to sort of look at how the vaccine behaves in sort of 2 areas where there was a high malaria transmission or malaria exposure, and areas where there was sort of low malaria exposure. And what we definitely show was that there was definitely a waning, and this was more pronounced in areas of low malaria exposure or high malaria exposure. And as you can see in the graph on your right, on your left, in the first two years, of course, there was a clear benefit that the vaccine was really protecting. And then there's a little bit of an excess of more malaria cases in the year 5 of the follow-up there, which we noted. But overall, we even looked at the overall sort of benefit. The vaccine was still beneficial. And this was also seen in phase 3 as well. So critical here was the 4th dose, which we did not give in phase 2 in those studies which we did in Kilifi, Kenya. So it is very important that the 5th dose perhaps could have given the slight advantage here. But also important to notice here is that the protection during the high-risk period is also a critical one. The strain specificity efficacy, which was later on discovered and published, of course, by in New England Journal of Medicine, calls for sort of a consideration for comprehensive surveillance when it comes to deployment of this vaccine to ensure that we don't select for specific strains. Next. So now we have this important tool with us that can really play a significant role, I'm sure, to support other tools. It's important to make sure that this vaccine is deployed to those children that need it the most. But of course, there are challenges with RTSS because of the number of doses that can be supplied. And with over 100 million doses required each year, only few can be supplied. So I think WHO came up with this framework to guide the prioritization of the supplies in the background of this challenge. And this is quite a fair document that sort of highlights that the area that need it the most, of course, need to be given it. And gradually other countries might definitely be able to access the vaccine. But also more important, the countries themselves have to make sure that they consider investing in the future, because as we know, with Gavi co-financing policy, and depending on the individual country development status, of course, countries have to contribute over time. So, of course, the final cost of the final dose of the cost of the dose of the vaccine, it becomes a very critical factor here when it comes to countries contributing as well into the deployment of the vaccine. Next. So another quite important, back one slide, sorry. Another important vaccine, which sort of is very similar to RTSS, is R21. And this is similar because it targets the same protein, circumsporozoite protein. The only difference is that in R21, you have more CS protein per particle of that particular candidate vaccine, because also it is not expressed with sort of free hepatitis B surface antigen. So I think this vaccine is being now tested in a phase 3 study, and we hope the results will be good as the ones in phase 2. And there's already the WHO pre-qualification process ongoing. Next. So the next vaccines, of course, we have blood stage vaccines. These are next generation blood stage vaccines which are being developed. The one which maybe I want to just mention briefly is RH5, and this is undergoing the phase sort of 2 trials at the moment, and it has been demonstrated that the vaccine produces an effective immune response that prevent infection of the red blood cells. Next. Horse positive vaccine in another candidate. Maybe I won't spend the time here because I think my time is running out, but this is a very important one. And Sanaria, the company led by Stephen Hoffman, have been figured out the way to manufacture this. And, it works through cytotoxic T cell responses attacking the infected red blood cells. And the studies are ongoing in Africa at the moment. They are also working on the genetically attenuated parasite, which appears to produce more immune responses. Next. So for the malaria eradication, obviously, we need different sets of vaccine. Of course, we need vaccines that can interrupt transmission. So both highly efficacious vaccines against the infection and blood stage could be technically be used as that, but also we have to have vaccines against all age groups. At the moment, most of the vaccines, these are targeting children, but we cannot achieve elimination without addressing the issue of adults. And the other issue, of course, is regulatory approval pathway for, vaccines that only target transmission stages, and there are a lot of discussion going on here, and perhaps modified CHMI could be an important tools to use. Next. So futures prospect, I think we are looking at messenger RNA technology platform. There are currently phase 1 studies going on for this particular for vaccine that target circumsporozoite protein. But this is a very important technology because it can enable us to induce immune response to a multiple antigen. This is very important. There are also multi-stage malaria vaccine under development involving multiple sort of stages, sort of maximizing the efficiency of protecting. And then monoclonal antibodies coming up, I think, and there are talks about combination of monoclonal antibodies and vaccines as well, or even vaccines and drugs to sort of maximize the impact. So all these are future prospects that we definitely see them in the future. I think that will be my last slide, I believe. Next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ali. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Hsiang. She's going to be speaking about research for malaria eradication.
Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I was asked to speak about eradication research, and I thought I'd provide an overview of where we've been and where we're headed. So malaria occurs from transmission of the parasite from usually one human to another through the mosquito, and research is generally focused on these 2 areas. Next slide. This is the timeline of major scientific breakthroughs and innovations to date. Next slide. So in green are major discoveries in basic biology with regards to the etiology, transmission, and tools to better study malaria, including culturing of the parasite and sequencing of the parasite and the mosquito. Next slide. With the discovery of the parasite in the 1880s came the discovery of how to diagnose malaria by microscopy. And since that time, we've only had one major innovation in diagnosis at the point of care, being rapid diagnostic tests, which emerged about 30 years ago. Next slide. Shown in red are discoveries and development of drugs. Our current standard of treatment centers around the artemisinin, for which Tuyoyo won a Nobel Prize in 2015. Next slide. On the mosquito side, our main tools have been insecticides that we use in indoor residual spraying, or IRS, or on bed nets. Next slide. And ultimately, public health impact of these new tools depends on widespread uptake. So as Jane detailed, in the 40s and 50s, scale up of IRS with DDT and also chloroquine led to many countries successfully eliminating malaria. But these ambitions fell short, partly due to drug and insecticide resistance. Since the early 2000s, we've had massive scale up of new rapid diagnostic tests, the artemisinin-based combination therapies, as well as bed nets and IRS using new insecticides. And notably, there's also been scale up of chemoprevention, which is the use of an anti-malarial in a different way. It's administered at regular intervals to vulnerable populations like children and pregnant women to clear current infection and prevent new infections. So next slide, this scale up has led in the last 20 years to halving of malaria cases and deaths, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. And more recently, we've had the approval of the first malaria RTSS vaccine, and it remains to be seen what the impact of the rollout of this vaccine as well as R21 will be. Next slide. So just prior to the COVID pandemic, the Lancet commissioned a group to consider the feasibility, affordability, and merit of malaria eradication. And our group at the Malaria Elimination Initiative served as a secretariat for this commission. The commission identified some priority areas to bend the curve on malaria in software, meaning implementation, hardware, referring to new tools, and financing. And focusing on the hardware, the anticipated barriers to eradication were, next slide, drug and diagnostic resistance. On the latter, the rapid diagnostic tests that we use detect this HRP2 antigen produced by Plasmodium falciparum, and we're seeing strains now that don't produce HRP2/3. Low density infections are another challenge, especially in low transmission settings where a higher proportion of infections are chronic and therefore low density. I actually have a collaboration with Olotu in Tanzania where we're looking at the use of PCR for testing and treatment and looking at the impact of that on all-cause child health. We also need better diagnosis and tools for Vivax and Ovale. These strains have a hypnozoite or a latent stage in the liver, which we have limited diagnostics and treatment for. On the vector side, there's a challenge of insecticide and behavioral resistance, as well as vectors that bite outdoors and therefore don't respond to our interventions that generally are indoor. There's the challenge that despite high coverage of interventions, transmission remains high in some areas. And finally, there's zoonotic spillover. Mainly monkey species have become the predominant malaria species in humans in some parts of Southeast Asia. Next slide. So addressing these challenges is going to require smarter use of our current tools, rollout of available tools, and development of deployment of new tools. Next slide. Just to cover some of the new tools that are currently in development and which are likely to play a major role in eradicating malaria, we need new and better diagnostics at the point of care. Next slide. Go back one. New medicines or combinations of medicines to combat resistance and treat non-falciparum strains. And then we need simpler regimens and novel deployment strategies at the individual and community level. I mentioned the use of chemoprevention to vulnerable populations. One area of research of ours at the Malaria Elimination Initiative is studying mass drug administration, drugs targeted to all age groups in hotspots with the aim of interrupting transmission. Next slide. We need new vaccines, as highlighted by Ali. Next slide. And we need new insecticides to overcome resistance and ones that last longer to facilitate delivery. Next slide. Bed nets and IRS, I mentioned target indoor transmission, and we need new products to address outdoor transmission. And some of the products that are in development now include hammocks, attractive targeted sugar baits, as well as spatial repellents and others. Next slide. Finally, there is gene drive or genetic engineering to propagate mosquitoes that will die or be unable to transmit malaria. And this is an exciting but controversial area. And while it holds great potential, I think most of us are hoping that we'll have a highly effective vaccine, which could make it less necessary to deploy this potentially higher risk intervention. Next slide. So in summary, in the last 200 years, we've had major scientific discoveries leading to the development of tools against parasite and mosquito. And since the 2000s, we've had scale up of interventions that have halved malaria cases and deaths. But to eradicate malaria, it's felt that we'll need new tools, the hardware, as well as better implementation approaches to software to target both the parasite and the vector. Thank you. This is just a link to our group's website if you're interested to learn more about our group's work.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to all our three speakers. I'm sure if we were all in the same room, there would be a large round of applause. I'm going to open us up to our questions from the audience. Ali, feel free to join us on video. And let's try to keep our responses brief so we can get through at least one question per person. So Jane, the first question is for you. It's sort of a big picture question. So there's a lot of global challenges these days that are going to require large investments, global coordination, and global research, for example, climate change. Why should we focus on malaria eradication now? What would you say to someone who is skeptical of this effort?
I think, like I mentioned, I think it's an important goal that we need to maintain, just looking at the sheer burden of malaria across the continent and the impact of malaria on lives lost, but also on the economy and also on growth and development of children. So whereas there are competing interests, I think in terms of an investment, the return on that investment for malaria eradication is quite huge. That would improve productivity across different settings, but also improve on health equity across the world. So whereas it seems like an insurmountable challenge, I think it's important that we maintain that as a focus, but break it down into small achievable bits so that it's not an overwhelming undertaking that is subject to failure because it's not really planned, as we've seen with the Global Malaria Eradication Plan. I think there are key lessons in there that will feed into subsequent eradication approaches. Thanks.
Thank you. So Ali, we have a number of questions from our audience about the malaria vaccine. I'll bundle them together. So one is the malaria vaccine a game changer? And are the efficacy rates that at least have been seen so far for RTSS similar to those for other vaccines? And then what's the probability that there will be a highly effective malaria vaccine in the next 10 years? And then the last one is a number of people have asked about these. I don't know if you're familiar with the recent cases that have been detected in the US and some other high income settings that are suggestive of local transmission. So some audience members are interested in whether you think there should be malaria vaccines available in these settings as well.
Thank you very much. Yes. So to start with the first one, I think I definitely believe the malaria vaccine will be a game changer in my view, and that would be my sort of view from looking at what we definitely have now. We definitely have a lot of tools that have been pointed out from previous speakers, but I think having a malaria vaccine that is highly efficacious would definitely be a game changer. I mean, vaccines, they have a lot of advantages. You can also know that, with a single or very few contact with sort of a healthcare setting, you have an opportunity to impart or to provide a long-term kind of a protection vis-a-vis other tools that might require sort of a frequent interaction with it. So I think if you can get a malaria vaccine that is efficacious enough, it could definitely be a game changer. Number two, in terms of the RTSS and these other vaccines, I think at the moment, as we have said, RTSS is about 30% efficacy against severe malaria. Will it be the best vaccine to use for eradication or elimination? Absolutely not. But it can definitely play a significant role in reducing the burden of malaria, especially because we know still there are parts of Africa where children die from severe malaria. And I mean, if you have a vaccine that can reduce the mortality, it's definitely something important to consider. R21 is very interesting. Looking at the data from West Africa, we saw efficacy of about 75%. That's quite high, well over the target that has been set. Actually, it was 77%, well over the target set up by the roadmap that I just talked about. And I think maybe I can just allude to you that what we are seeing in phase 3 is pretty similar to what was shown in phase 2 studies in Burkina Faso. So this will be a very interesting vaccine. Can we compare it to RTSS? Of course, a difficult one, because I mean, this has been done at a different time point. There might have been slightly changes. RTSS was not tested in a seasonal vaccination sort of setting. So in R75 is being tested with that. So there are two vaccination approach. Seasonal vaccination, so you vaccinate kids all the 3 doses just before the high transmission season, vis-a-vis sort of a standard vaccination. And I think it will be very interesting to look at the data, which will be coming out very soon this year, and sort of look and compare what is seen with those two different vaccination approaches. I think I mean, the last question, maybe I missed it a bit. I mean, I'm not really aware of this. I may be sort of happy to learn a little bit more about these areas where there are some sort of local transmission. So I didn't get the question right, whether these were within Africa, in places where malaria had been sort of significantly reduced, or is this in the Western sort of northern sort of countries where this malaria was sort of, eliminated. So I wasn't sure about that at all. Maybe you may want to clarify that a little bit.
Yes, the question was about cases in the US.
Oh, right. So so I'm not aware of those cases. I think probably I missed that information, but I think in whether we need vaccine in those places, it must be maybe an isolated sort of event, which perhaps sort of in the long-term strategy of public health sort of you may not want to deploy vaccines, perhaps. But I think, I mean, vaccines, in my view, will definitely play a significant role in areas where malaria is endemic. And definitely this will be my sort of suggestion, maybe for now. Yeah, I don't know, maybe others have that we want to comment on this. Yeah.
Yeah, Michelle, do you want to add?
Oh, I would just say that, Ali, you had that slide on, the equitable distribution of malaria vaccines and where the priority should be, which is where the highest risk is and where the largest health benefit will be. For the transmission that's happening in places like the US appears to be isolated right now. I think it's the risk-benefit ratio probably doesn't favor the use, but I would imagine that as the vaccines become more widely available, people will be interested to use them, say, for traveling when they're going to high-risk locations, and perhaps that will also help fund, vaccines where the funds are limited.
I think you're raising a very important point there, Michelle. Absolutely right. I think the last point you just mentioned, vaccines for travelers, I think this is a slightly different kind of goal as well, because yes, we want to address the challenge of malaria in malaria-endemic countries, but also, of course, for travelers who are at a higher risk, for example, coming from an area where there's no malaria transmission, so they're very naive in terms of their immune responses, and which they suffer from malaria that could be very, very sort of, the consequence is significant. Therefore, having someone protected while he's visiting sites of high malaria transmission makes perfect sense. And as you rightly say, most manufacturers would target this particular indication to raise funding as well to support the development of vaccine for the larger population that bear the largest brunt in endemic countries. Yes.
Thank you, Ali and Michelle. And Michelle, I have a question specifically for you now. So in terms of research, do you think there's anything we need to change about the way that we do research on malaria to achieve eradication? So for example, you talked about hardware versus software. Do we have the right ratio of research efforts to each of those areas? And also, what kind of research do you think is going to be most important to deliver evidence that can actually translate into policy for eradication?
Yeah, I mean, I think I focused more on hardware on the talk, but we need both. And just to remind the audience that, around World War II, almost all of the world was malaria endemic. And since that time, half of the countries have gone malaria-free, including the United States. And in the last 20 years, on average, one country has gone malaria-free. And so each of these countries has gotten there without a vaccine, without new tools. And I think it is feasible to, improve the software to better target and tailor our interventions. And with the right leadership and community engagement, political will and financing, like we can get there in a lot of places. But I do think there is the challenge of high transmission areas where they do roll out every intervention that we have and malaria will come down, but then it resurges when there's insecticide resistance or something else. And I think that in these areas, we will need new tools to really drive down transmission and get to the point where it's very low transmission, and then you can just sort of optimize existing tools. And that's where I think something like a vaccine will really play a role in particularly high transmission areas like areas in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. So in our final minutes, I have a question I'd like to pose to each of you, and we can go through Jane and then Ali and Michelle. So let's say 10 years from now, we reconvene this panel, still talking about malaria eradication, assuming we haven't achieved it by then. What do you hope that we would be talking about in that panel 10 years from now? Jane, I'll pass it.
Okay. I mean, I think we will be sharing higher numbers of countries that have achieved elimination and some of the success stories in those countries. And I think in addition to the hardware, one of the things that we will be talking about is how the programs have been able to strengthen the software for us to be able to sustain the benefits or the gains from some of these interventions that are developed, but just to kind of look at the change in the programs across mainly sub-Saharan Africa and how they deploy the lessons that have been learned to ensure that we are at that last mile. I would want to say that at that point, we will be discussing some of the aspects that really are at the last mile from the elimination to possibly now having targets for eradication. Thank you.
Ali, what are your thoughts?
10 years from now, well, okay. to take an optimistic point of view and being a person who is very passionate about malaria vaccine, I hope in 10 years we'll be talking about how significant, impact malaria vaccine have had or have contributed in sort of, achieving some of the elimination in some of the countries. And maybe we'll be talking more about sort of surveillance, post sort of deployment surveillance of these vaccine programs to sort of look at the impact and, trying to sort of figure out, how to ensure that we continue to, to ensure that the vaccine remains efficacious and, there are no sort of, vaccine sort of, we're not selecting for specific types, but, maintaining that impact of vaccine, but mostly, hopefully, talking about how vaccines have been successful in contributing toward eliminating malarias, hopefully.
And Michelle?
I think I echo Jane and Ali's comments. I hope and I think that in 10 years, we'll be talking about elimination in a country in sub-Saharan Africa. So far, the success stories have been outside sub-Saharan Africa. And also we'll be talking about, that we'll have better ways to target and tailor interventions, because it's not going to be like one magic bullet. It's going to be how we use new diagnostics, drugs, vaccines, vector control together in the right mix. We can't do it all everywhere all at once. Like it has to be the right mix. And that combination, I think we're still figuring out what's the right combination when and where.
Thank you. So thank you all for attending today. It's time to wrap up. I've appreciated the insights from our fantastic panelists, as well as the participation from our audience members. You'll receive an email once the event recording is available, and please share it with your friends and peers who couldn't make it. And just thank you again. I hope you all have a great day.